Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bioenergy 2030, Unlocking Australia's Future Renewable Energy Giant. I'm Shahana McKenzie, CEO of Bioenergy Australia, and we're delighted to be hosting this event and the fantastic speaker lineup that we have today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of Canberra and this region. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. Obviously, we're very disappointed that we are not having this event face-to-face at Parliament House today, but we do have a wonderful speaker lineup, as I said, and we've been really quite overwhelmed with the number of registrations that we've had of people wanting to attend the event. So we have some great sponsors for today's event as well, including EDL, LMS, and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. I'd like to thank our sponsors, but also our members and our supporters who have been with us over this challenging COVID period. We've been able to, because of their support, continue to drive forward Australia's bioeconomy, and that includes the release last year of Australia's first Bioenergy Roadmap, which we're delighted to have had that released. I would also like to thank Bioenergy Australia's staff, especially Lauren, who is running today's event. As I'm sure you can imagine, it's a really challenging time to be somebody who's running events at the moment, and she's done an incredible job being very proactive to all of the changing environments that we've had to operate under. Following the release of Australia's first Bioenergy Roadmap in late 2021, Bioenergy Australia is committed to accelerating the development of Australia's bioeconomy. Today is a step in that direction. How do we capitalise on the opportunity? How do we ensure that we create these domestic industries? How do we ensure that we can be adding that $10 billion to the GDP and the 26,000 new jobs? So to kick off our first session, we have Bioenergy Australia board member and CEO of EDL, James Harman. James has led EDL's rapid growth global expansion since 2016, including investing in biomethane to transportation fuel projects and biomethane to electricity projects in North America, and delivering innovative large-scale hybrid renewable microgrid projects in remote areas of Australia, enabling the effective transition from fossil fuels. He is keenly focused on safety, growth, and diversification into new markets as EDL strives to be the leading global producer of sustainable distributed energy. Over to you, James.
Rookie error, I was still on mute. Thanks very much, Shahana, and thanks to you and to Bioenergy Australia for putting on this great event today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we're meeting today, and there are many of them across Australia. In my case, here in Brisbane, it's the Yuggera and Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. This event comes at a pivotal moment. We're all on a decarbonisation journey, and bioenergy has a key role to play. This is a moment when we understand the true costs of not taking strong action on climate change and the opportunities for all of us if we do. A moment, as Minister Taylor has made clear, when we should be harnessing all available technologies to help address that challenge and that opportunity. And a time where the contribution bioenergy can make to providing sustainable energy and reducing Australia's carbon footprint has never been more clear. EDL has been on a bioenergy journey for over 30 years. In that time, we've grown to be a leading global producer of sustainable distributed energy, and our success is fueled by two things: our commitment to continually innovate and our ability to leverage and integrate different technologies to deliver reliable, cost-effective, clean energy outcomes. Innovation is at the very core of what we do. Right now, we're investing in work that goes beyond the conversion of landfill gas to electricity. We're now upgrading landfill gas to zero emissions biomethane, or as it's known in the US, renewable natural gas, or RNG, which you'll hear a bit more about in this conference. Biomethane is versatile. It can be injected into the existing natural gas pipeline system and used in place of fossil fuel-derived natural gas as an industrial feedstock or to produce heat and power. It can be compressed or liquefied into transport biofuels for use in heavy transport. It can also be used to produce green hydrogen. And production of biomethane via anaerobic digestion also produces digestate for use as a crop enhancer and commercial grade carbon dioxide. And with the federal government support, we're currently exploring what to do with that waste carbon dioxide, and we're looking at injecting that waste CO2 into concrete. Doing this strengthens the concrete and reduces the amount of cement needed, reducing the emissions involved in construction, which can be a game changer. You'll hear later this morning from Johannes Escudero, the CEO of North America's RNG Coalition. The US biomethane industry is expanding rapidly, with around 250 operating facilities, 100 more in construction, and another 100 planned. And they put on a massive conference in California every December. Last time I went there 3 years ago, there were about 500 people there. This year I couldn't get there because of COVID, or just the end of last year, but they sold out at 1,200 people. And it's just going from strength to strength, that industry in the US. And it'll be great to hear from Johannes later this morning. And with 29 landfill gas to electricity sites, EDL is one of the US's top 5 landfill gas producers. And we're transitioning right now many of our LFG power stations into biomethane plants. 3 of those plants are operating right now, with 2 more being constructed. We're ramping up to supply 8 petajoules of renewable gas per annum through the North America gas pipeline network. Our experience in the US is that the right policies are needed to make biomethane viable. It's exactly the same here. And as the title of this session says, Australia's political landscape will drive the future bioeconomy. It's a real privilege for us to hear today from Minister Angus Taylor and then from Shadow Minister Chris Bowen. A shame, as Shahana said, we can't do it in person, but this is still pretty good. And before I introduce Minister Taylor, I'd just like to touch on our learnings from the US and what it might mean for the development of an Australian biomethane industry. There's clearly an increasing demand for low carbon alternatives to conventional gas and liquid fuels, and an awareness of the need to make the best possible uses of our other resources, including organic waste in its many forms. Importantly, it's very clear that we need a range of low carbon gas and fuel to address a range of applications. We face 2 policy challenges in my view. The first is helping to educate users about those low carbon opportunities and which of those fuels can best meet their needs, and that's happening very rapidly. The market is evolving very quickly in Australia and demand is starting to grow. The second is to ensure that the supply is there to meet that growing demand reliably and at an efficient cost. And this is where the US provides such a strong example through programs such as the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, the California Low Carbon Fuel Scheme, and a range of state green gas procurement mandates. Those schemes set clear, longer-term targets, but also provide flexible mechanisms so the markets can grow towards them without jeopardising either supply or demand. It's these features that have been critical to the rapid and sustainable growth of the US biomethane industry. The challenge is, how do we replicate that success here? It's my pleasure shortly to introduce the Honourable Angus Taylor MP, Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Angus is well known to many of you. He's worked tirelessly to ensure that Australia's energy system decarbonises in a way that's both reliable and affordable for the nation's businesses and households. He's championed this country's efforts to develop and deliver new carbon abatement technologies and also to broaden and deepen the supply of high quality carbon offsets. He's always been open and engaging with our industry, understanding and supportive of the abatement and energy opportunities that EDL has sought to explore. I just touched on the key policy challenges in developing a local industry. The Minister has, as you know, and as Shahana mentioned, taken essential actions to support us. The first and the most critical is the delivery last year of Australia's first Bioenergy Roadmap, which sets out the significant scale of the bioenergy opportunity for Australia and a set of policy actions needed to help deliver it. The second is to progress several of those actions to help build a voluntary bioenergy market, such as including coverage under the National Gas Framework, exploring extending green power certification to bioenergy products, and developing a new emissions reduction fund biomethane method, which came through recently. Pragmatically, it will take a combination of federal, state and local government actions, working with a range of industry stakeholders and customers to ensure success for this industry. We look forward to hearing more from Minister Taylor on how the government will continue to support our critical and emerging industry. Over to Minister Taylor.
Well, thank you, James. Can you hear me all right there?
Can do, thank you.
Look, thank you for that introduction. Very much appreciate it. And can I acknowledge the wonderful work that EDL has done over time in this area. As you know, James, I've been watching EDL the work that you've done for a long time, and I think you've really pioneered an area of energy generation and use of bioenergy feedstock, which has been enormously important for this country and has played an important role, not just in providing energy for all of us, but also in bringing down emissions. And I think EDL's role, whilst your role is evolving and the focuses are evolving over time, I think you're having trouble with the camera here. Hang on.
There you are. We could hear you, just couldn't see you.
Yeah, okay, that's better.
See you now.
Thank you for all the work you do. I don't need to tell anyone on this call that bioenergy is an important tool for our economy, for our goals in bringing down emissions, whether it's in power generation, transport fuel, blending into our extensive natural gas network, which you mentioned, James, up front. There's a multitude of ways that it can play a role as a sustainable energy source. And I'll cover a few of those opportunities today and how the government is working with the industry and wants to work with the industry into the future as well. Last year, of course, as you mentioned, James, ARENA developed the Bioenergy Roadmap, and it's a piece of work I know many of you here were involved with, and I thank you very much for your contributions in it. Of course, that laid out what are some very significant opportunities for Australia, for our energy sector, and it made the point, amongst other points, that this is a great opportunity for regional Australia, and I think this is an important part of the story and an important part of the opportunity that we need to tap into in the coming years. It also showed that there are areas where bioenergy already has some real competitive advantages versus alternatives. And one of the focuses of our technology investment roadmap and our broader work on the pathway to net zero is focus on the economics of different technologies, where they do best. Otherwise, someone has to pay, and it's always very easy to sort of come up with a solution. It's a very expensive solution for customers, for consumers, for middle Australia. We'll always look for the solutions that avoid raising the cost of energy, that avoid large costs to taxpayers. We want to see the economics of low emissions technologies really working and being deployed because they work, both for the customer, for the investor, and of course for the environment. And it's that focus on getting the economics of all three aligned is a hugely important part of our technology focus, our technology strategy, and our broader emissions reduction strategy. And that's what Technology Not Taxes is all about. We recognise in that strategy we have to have a portfolio of technologies. Now, there are some who like to pick and choose and say, well, I don't like that particular technology, it's ideologically unsound for some particular reason. You know, from my point of view, this challenge, and from the government's point of view, this challenge is too big to rule technologies out. We need to be ruling them in. We need every possible tool in the toolkit here to deliver affordable, reliable energy and bring down our emissions at the same time. And ruling technologies out is quite simply madness. So that's how we're thinking about this problem. Now, the truth is, Australia has always been good at adopting technologies that are economic, that are working, that are commercial. And that's a big part of the reason why our emissions are down by over 20% since 2005. Solar in particular has played an enormously important role in that. I mean, it's an extraordinary story of 12% cost reductions per year for 50 years, since the early 1970s, 12% a year, year on year on year. The result of that is the world saw 1 gigawatt of generation put in place by around the year 2000. But that has multiplied at an extraordinary pace, 100 gigawatts by 2012, and we're about to get to 1,000. So these things are exponential when the economics start to work. And we think there are areas where bioenergy can see that kind of economic, scalable opportunity. And I want to talk about a few of those in particular. All of these are areas where there can be a real contribution to us getting to our targets, meeting and beating our targets. I mean, our approach is always to set a target and then smash it. And that's exactly what we've done with Kyoto, and we will absolutely do that with Paris we're already on track to get to 35% reduction, well above our target of 26 to 28%, but we need every tool in the toolkit, as I say. Now, usually the areas where we see bioenergy playing an important role is those particularly hard to abate sectors. And one of those is sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF. And this is an area where we see real opportunity for biofuels. They have been identified as one of the few low emissions alternatives to traditional jet or maritime fuels in the short to medium term. We know that SAF can be dropped into the existing aircraft fleet and refueling infrastructure without major cost and costly modifications being needed over and above the cost of the fuel itself. And the aviation industry, of course, understands this already, with more than 95% of Qantas's emissions coming directly from jet fuel. To act on the challenge, Qantas was the first Australian airline to purchase SAF on an ongoing basis, which was great news. We're partnering with industry on the development of advanced sustainable aviation and marine biofuels. And we've committed a further $33.5 million to ARENA to specifically focus on additional research, development and deployment of those biofuels through a co-funding program. And this is a different approach we've been taking with ARENA. ARENA has enormous capability in this area. They did, of course, the work on the Bioenergy Roadmap, but rather than just relying on their ongoing funding, which they manage and they make decisions on, we have picked some areas where we're asking them specifically to focus funding with additional budget allocations, and that's the case here. That additional investment will help these advanced biofuels become more cost competitive than traditional aviation and maritime fuels. And that's the way to get uptake. If we can bring the cost of those low emissions aviation fuels down, then the uptake will go up. It's as simple as that. The funding will also enhance Australia's fuel security. So there's other byproducts from this policy outcomes that we are very supportive of in this era of challenged supply chains. That's particularly attractive. So I very much encourage the industry to get involved with ARENA as this program rolls out later in the year. The next area we're focused on with support is one that James mentioned up front, the use of biogas in our natural gas networks. And I personally seen the scale of this opportunity. I think it's very exciting. Biogas can be processed to produce a biomethane product with the same specifications as natural gas, and that means it can be used in existing gas infrastructure and appliances. And I first started looking at this 15 years ago or more, and you could see the opportunity there, and I've spoken with James about it on a number of occasions. This is why our broader gas-fired recovery and gas investment framework not only supports natural gas, but also includes opportunities for renewable gases and clean hydrogen. And that's been a very deliberate part of our approach to the gas-fired recovery. The 2021 Low Emissions Technology Statement includes a commitment that government will work with industry, consumers, state and territory governments over the next 12 months to develop a voluntary zero emissions gas market in Australia. And we think the potential there is significant. The demand now for low emissions solutions particularly from industry, but increasingly from smaller business and households, is very real and very significant. And we think that market is one that we can build quickly. It'll drive early demand for clean hydrogen and other zero emissions gases and recognise consumers' voluntary purchase of zero emissions gases. Fostering that market will also provide the revenue producers of low emissions gases, such as biomethane, allowing them to scale up quickly to bring down production costs. And that's what we want to see as quickly as we can. In addition to this, in August last year, energy ministers agreed that biomethane, along with hydrogen blends, should be brought within the scope of the natural gas regulatory framework. And that allows for a whole series of opportunities that might otherwise not exist. A draft legislative package will be presented to ministers for approval by the middle of this year, following consultation over the next few months. And those reforms will ensure that the regulatory arrangements, consumer protections continue to work as intended when biomethane is supplied. It'll provide certainty for investors to inject biomethane into the natural gas network, which is exactly what we want to see as quickly as we can. To support biogas even further, we've introduced a new biomethane method package under the Emissions Reduction Fund. And I'm also personally excited about this opportunity. The ERF will now credit eligible biomethane projects under 3 existing ERF waste management methods, including animal effluent management, landfill gas generation, and domestic, commercial and industrial wastewater. And that'll provide an additional incentive for reduction in emissions in 2 scenarios. One, or the first one, when biogas from the breakdown of organic waste is captured, refined into biomethane and combusted. And the second, when it's used as a natural gas substitute. And we'll, in parallel with that, progress research to support the recognition of other sources of agricultural waste as feedstocks to support an enhanced ERF biomethane or a green gas method in the future. And this is part of a broader push to expand as quickly as we can the credits. Apologies for that noise in the background. That's the bells ringing, but I don't need to go. To support enhanced ERF biomethane or green gas methods in the future. But it's part of this broader focus on making sure we have as broad a source of crediting under the ERF as we possibly can, and we see real opportunity here. We've also seen bioenergy being used in several of our government-backed microgrid studies, and these are important localised projects that allow us to pioneer technologies. They'll never be commercial in their own right, but by setting up localised pilots, we can test technologies, and as they prove up, they can be scaled, of course. And so, for example, I've been fortunate to visit Innovating Energy's microgrid project in Nowra on the south coast of New South Wales, not far from my electorate. And the project was awarded $3 million in grant funding to test the feasibility of a range of microgrid technologies, including a biogas anaerobic digester power generator to supply lower cost power to dairy farmers in Nowra, otherwise known as poo power. But a pretty exciting opportunity in the agricultural area. And we know agriculture is the source of many of these opportunities, but it's a great example of an innovative solution to a uniquely regional issue. So the new funding and reforms I've talked about today build on the investments that we've already made in the bioenergy sector. We've invested almost $500 million through ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We'll continue to. The roadmap that was done through ARENA will help to guide the next rounds of private and public investment. And it's important that all levels of government, industry and research work on these actions to realise the benefits. We've seen the power of alignment with innovation through the pandemic. If we can get everyone moving in the same direction with a mission-oriented approach, we can really have an impact. And I think that can be true of clean energy technologies just as it can be of medical technologies as well. Bioenergy is obviously an important part of the portfolio of the mix, and adopting bioenergy technologies can help reduce Australia's emissions, particularly in these really tough to abate sectors. So we'll continue to work with you, and we've enjoyed the opportunities we've had to work with you in recent times. I'm sure they will continue into the future. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you here today.
Thank you, Minister. I know it's a very busy time for you with Parliament sitting right now, but really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you again for your continued support of the industry. It's critical. Much appreciated. Minister,
Thanks,
do you have time to take any questions, or do you?
Yeah, I can take a couple.
All right, we've got Q&A on Zoom, so we'll have a go at that. There's a question that's come through from Alan Green asking, what actual technology routes does the Minister see to reducing the cost of SAF in Australia to be competitive with petroleum-based jet fuel?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a good question. Ultimately, what we've got to do is work with industry, with the customers in particular, to find pathways to bring down the costs. Ultimately, the technologists, this is a question for them more than me, but the way we're thinking about it is that if we can get R&D projects going with industry, involving customers, and that's the key. I mean, so often these projects will only succeed if the customers get involved, and we've got that engagement with Qantas leading the way, of course. We can squeeze those costs down, but we need the technologists focused on every lever to bring those costs down. I mean, this is the key. If you look at solar, and I use it as an illustration, I know it's not bioenergy, but it's such an extraordinary illustration of how technology can act as a disruptor in a way that gives us a reduction in emissions and good economics at the same time. But the key there was just continual innovation, every last bit. And as we look forward with solar, we know going through to 2030, we can see the levers around energy efficiency, the PV cells, but also the installation costs of those. Every lever now is being pulled to try and bring those costs down. I was with the Indians last night who are building massive amounts. And that's an opportunity for us to really drive some innovations. Now, we have to take that same kind of relentless approach to continual innovation when it comes to aviation fuels and low emissions aviation fuels. This is one of the toughest nuts to crack. It's not going to happen overnight. We know how difficult this one is. When you look at the list of emissions reductions opportunities, it's really right up there. But biofuels is one of the ways we can do it. It's not the only option available, but it's a really attractive one. But we are going to have to pull every possible lever to make the economics work.
Thank you, Minister. Perhaps if you've got time for one more question, the next couple of questions on the Q&A are similar. I'll try and combine the two, and it's around small-scale bioenergy R&D and rural industries. What support is there to help rural industries, rural producers actually get into the market? And when they're a long way from a gas pipeline or a gas network, how do you see them contributing to the bioenergy solution here, the small players, and getting into the market?
It's a good question, James. And I did mention that Nowra project. It's an illustration. There's others, but I used it because I think it is a good example. That's a microgrid illustration, so it doesn't require getting access to the network. We are seeing this dramatic improvement in these microgrid technologies now that are particularly well suited to rural applications and more remote applications. So that is a real focus for us. I specifically went to see that project because I just thought it had the hallmarks of something exciting, but something that can also be scaled if we can really get it to work. Often these are technologies that are not, this is not completely new or anything like that. We're configuring it in new ways. And in doing so, we're learning a lot about how to do it. But the microgrids program in particular, I'd really encourage those who are trying to work up these technologies and get them out into the field. That has been a really very, very successful program. And we'd like to see more bioenergy projects coming through it.
Thanks, Minister. It's something that EDL is actually looking at for microgrids, trying to decarbonise our remote hybrid power stations more with biofuels and biogas, renewable diesel, etc. So completely agree. Minister, might leave it there, let you get back to your day. But again, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Good on you. Thanks, James.
Thank you. All right, well, hopefully we have Chris Bowen nearby, but it's my pleasure now to introduce the Honourable Chris Bowen MP, Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change. And as people would know, Chris is very experienced in Canberra, having been responsible for several key portfolios, both in government and in opposition, including most recently as Shadow Treasurer and Shadow Minister for Health, now Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change. Chris and his party have a clear commitment to seizing the opportunities provided by the energy and carbon transition while managing the associated uncertainties. And with the election just around the corner, I know Chris is keen to share with us more about the role bioenergy will play and how a vibrant local bioenergy industry will be delivered. So with that, can I hand over to Minister Bowen, please?
Good morning, James, and thanks for inviting me to join this morning. And I want to acknowledge the fact that I'm joining you from Parliament House, which is the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and celebrate their elders past, present and emerging. Well, I'm just going to speak fairly briefly today because I do want to leave time for questions. I don't like coming in and providing a lecture without giving at least some time for questions, although, as you heard from Angus's presentation, it is a sitting day and bells can ring, so time may be a bit tight, but I do want to leave as much time as possible for questions. But your forum today comes at a pretty important time, I reckon, and a pretty important juncture. 3 months since the release of the Bioenergy Roadmap, and almost certainly 3 months to the next election, almost exactly. So a pretty important midway point, I think, for your sector. Now, the Bioenergy Roadmap, I thought, was a decent enough document, particularly as it made clear the potential of the sector, including $10 billion in GDP, 26,000 new jobs and emissions reduction of 9%. And I think that is a very good indicator to the broader community of what the potential is. But what's important is that the next election will determine whether that potential is realised or whether that bioenergy roadmap becomes just another marketing document sitting on the shelf gathering dust in coming years. One of the many marketing documents that have been released about energy policy over the last 9 years, or whether it actually becomes a real roadmap. And certainly I want to see a real roadmap. And while I welcome the release of the roadmap, I certainly want to see a change of government to unlock that potential. Now, over the last 9 years, we've seen several attempts at national energy policy, and we've seen several attempts to try and get some bipartisanship around national energy policy. Probably the closest example of that, the best example, is the National Energy Guarantee, which was a Liberal policy. We didn't particularly love it. It wasn't what we would have designed, but we said we would support it because we were keen to get bipartisanship around energy policy. But unfortunately, that policy collapsed in the coalition party room, as many other policies have collapsed in the coalition party room, not under force of pressure from us, but under force of pressure from the right-wing rump within the government, which doesn't believe in any action on climate change. So in the absence of the national framework and the various attempts to get one, the current government has resorted to picking winners. Now, I think there's a couple of problems with that. The first is there's a very real risk of picking the wrong ones, picking the losers. Take the government's so-called gas-fired recovery. Now, I have been very clear that gas will play a role in our system for many years to come. It plays a role in firming and peaking and in hard-to-abate sectors, providing energy for key industries which can only rely on gas for the foreseeable future. But the idea that our national economic recovery is somehow predicated on gas-fired recovery, the recovery from COVID-19 is one that's related to an expansion of gas, is a complete fraud. It is a fabrication and it should be called out as such. It's a nonsense that influences policy far too much to the detriment of other good technologies. And that's the second problem with picking winners. They do come with losers. Inevitably, government's resources are finite, and when a government picks a winner, that means that somebody else misses out. Now, so as I said, while I welcome the roadmap, and I think it's a decent enough document, it was a day late and $1 short. Or more accurately, I should say it was 18 months late and came with a fraction of the investment we've seen in other technologies. The government claims it'll be spending $20 billion this decade on the transition to net zero. Well, if that's right, the money announced alongside the roadmap is exactly 0.2% of the total. Now, the government is investing much more in other technologies, including some established technologies, where the case for a public subsidy is far from clear, in my view. Now, to take the latest example, having failed to legislate the underwriting new generation investment program, the minister now is seeking to implement the UNGI program via regulation without parliamentary scrutiny. The minister wants a blank cheque to support 10 projects, 5 gas projects and 5 pumped hydro projects under a process that has been listed for scrutiny by the Auditor General. This is what I'm talking about when I mention the government's picking winners approach. He's picked 5 gas projects to support through the UNGI process and 5 pumped hydro projects. Now, no doubt some of these projects are worthy. The Battery of the Nation project is particularly worthy in Tasmania, for example. But no minister, let alone, frankly, this minister, should have that level of discretion to pick winners that they choose. Therefore, Labor will be supporting disallowance of the UNGI regulation in the Parliament. It gives too much discretion to the minister to pick projects, and it is not a level playing field for other proponents, including bioenergy. And of course, the government has excluded bioenergy from the list of priority low emissions technologies. Now, I welcome your call for sustainable aviation fuel and renewable gas to be added to that list. I understand it, and I'm sympathetic to where you're coming from. It would be easy for me to announce that I would be adding them to the list, but I actually have a different approach. We wouldn't be picking more winners. What we would be doing is taking a more holistic approach to policy development and allowing experts and the market to determine technologies which go forward. So it's an approach which requires and would restore a national policy framework for coherent policy making instead of ad hoc picking of winners and losers by the government of the day. Now, let me take you through some of the essential elements of the approach that were reflected in the Powering Australia policy that Anthony and I announced last year, a very comprehensive policy announcement backed by very comprehensive economic modelling. Of course, firstly and briefly, our commitment to net zero. Now, net zero is the essential starting point of good climate policy. It is not the end, it is not even the middle, it is just the very essential basic starting point. We've been committed to net zero since 2015, and it's a commitment that we would seek to legislate in government. I welcome the fact that government's now caught up to us in 2021 and committing to net zero by 2050, but it's far too late, and is only just the essential starting point. Every state and territory, the vast majority of the business community, many local councils committed to it a long time ago. So the government comes at this very, very late. The 6-year delay, as well as the government's continuing refusal to legislate net zero, speaks to the ongoing forces of denial and delay, I think, within the government of the day. So the second element of our approach is the medium term, of course, the 2030 target, and our commitment to a 43% emissions reduction target. Now, of course, the current target of the country is 26 to 28%, below 2005 levels. That was Tony Abbott's target. And we've been through several prime ministers since then, but we're still stuck with Tony Abbott's target. And we are now way behind the rest of the world. Of course, as you know, Canada at 40 to 45, Japan at 46, United States at 50. Our lack of ambition matters to the climate, given that we are one of the highest per capita emitters in the world, indeed in the top 20 absolute terms emitters to the world. And it also matters to our economy because it sends the message that global markets and investors that our national government isn't serious about the energy transition while we have an official pathetic target of 26 to 28. So we would very quickly, on coming to office, presumably in May, we would very quickly improve our nationally determined contribution to 43% by 2030. And that'll bring us back into the pack, bring us back into the step with the rest of the world. And the third element of our approach is perhaps the most important, and that is that 43% isn't just a target, it's the model outcome of the policies we've announced. We didn't just say 43 and we'll work out how to get there later. We actually announced a series of policies. We've got Reputex to model their impact on emissions reduction as well as their economic impact. And the net result is our commitment to a 43% emissions reduction target. It's an ambitious plan, but achievable because we've announced policies to achieve it. And it's been backed, as I said, by the most comprehensive economic modelling that any government has, or that any opposition, has ever released about any policy ever in Australian history. No opposition has ever released the sort of detail and the sort of modelling that we released when we announced the Powering Australia plan. We've done that. And I say, frankly, the government hasn't been able to lay a finger on that modelling or that policy announcement. You don't hear very much from the government about our policy, which is quite extraordinary when you consider how toxic climate politics have been in Australia for the last 20 years. The modelling shows that our Powering Australia policy will create over 600,000 jobs. It'll cut power bills across the national energy market. It'll increase the share of renewables in the NEM to 82% by 2030. That policy framework is an enormous opportunity for bioenergy and renewable energy more broadly. We've got our safeguard mechanism policy, for example, which will drive the adoption of renewable industrial heat. Now, of course, as you know, the safeguard mechanism was introduced by the current government. It was designed when Scott Morrison was in cabinet and implemented when he was the treasurer. It was intended to stop industrial emissions rising, but it's failed. They've been going up ever since the safeguard mechanism came in. But the architecture of the safeguard mechanism is perfectly sensible. What we'll do is we'll take that architecture and we'll make it work to drive emissions down in cooperation with industry. And that's why groups like the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, National Farmers Federation have all backed our policy. These are the people who will be absolutely essential to getting to net zero, and they are backing Labor's policy. For those facilities that are already covered, Powering Australia adopts the improvements that have been recommended, for example, by the Business Council and makes the safeguard mechanism meaningful. So we'll put the safeguard facilities on a meaningful trajectory to net zero by 2050, consistent with the commitment that 2/3 of those facilities have already made. Now, within that trajectory, each facility will be able to work out how they will reduce their emissions, their least cost form of abatement. And the Reputex modelling that I mentioned, that very comprehensive modelling, actually assumes that many facilities will do that by switching to bioenergy. That's the assumption that the modellers have made, and I think it's a pretty powerful assumption. And we'll support those facilities and sectors like yours with through a couple of different mechanisms. Up to $3 billion from our National Reconstruction Fund will support the deployment of low emissions technologies to kickstart innovation, including in facilities covered by the safeguard mechanism will also revitalise manufacturing and secure Australia's energy future. And a new Powering the Regions fund will keep Australian industry competitive in a changing economy and ensure our regions thrive. So these are just two initiatives, and I think Bioenergy certainly should be looking closely at those funds and those initiatives and working with industry at the opportunities that funding stream would open up should we be honoured to win the election in May. Our policy specifically mentions bioenergy is eligible for support under those funds. But as I said earlier, I want those decisions made by the market and by experts, not by me. I won't be picking winners, sitting in my office in Canberra, deciding which particular fuel I like or don't like. That's up to you with industrial partners to progress. But the important thing is a policy framework to allow those investment decisions to be made, to allow the market to do its job with a consistent and clear policy trajectory towards net zero is what this country so desperately needs and what only, frankly, a Labor government can implement. So they're the fundamentals of the approach that I'm outlining here today. Of course, there's a lot more detail under the policy. It's a very comprehensive policy we announced with a lot of programs under it, a lot of detail. But I didn't want to detain you with that today. I do want to leave time for questions, suggestions and accusations briefly before I get called into Parliament. But I do want to emphasise I look forward to working with your sector as I do with contributors across the board. I know many of your senior members and very active members. I've been out to LMS, for example, and seen the great work that they're doing and a big supporter of their work. And I look forward to working with all your members and with you as a group should I be honoured to become the Climate Change and Energy Minister in May. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you again for taking the time. I know it is a very busy time with Parliament sitting, and really appreciate the effort that you've made to talk to us and engage with us today. Maybe I'll just kick off with a question, and it goes to the policy framework. I don't know if you caught my introduction a while back, but I think that's fundamental to getting this industry really off the ground. And the Bioenergy Roadmap is a start, but it doesn't really set up the policy framework that's needed to make this industry successful. You mentioned that Labor won't pick winners, and but I think you were saying in a different kind of way that you recognise that SAF and renewable gas have a key part to play in the decarbonisation of many sectors in the economy. I look forward to seeing that policy framework rolled out and to understand more about how the Labor government would support the bridging, which is inevitably needed, and particularly how much can be learnt from overseas, which is again a point I was making earlier, from Europe, from the US, from Canada, that have very active and booming bioenergy, biomethane, SAF industries. I think there's just so much potential there for us to not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but see what others have done and replicate it to the extent that it's relevant in Australia. More a statement than a question, but looking forward to seeing more detail around that if and when you're successful in the next election. Maybe I'll just go to the Q&A in the boxes here, and if anybody's got any questions, please send them through. But Alan Green's asked a similar question, I think, to what I was alluding to, and saying, given the lead time for achieving cost reduction in SAF by technology innovation, would a Labor government consider bridging support mechanisms to enable earlier adoption and transition to scale, such as is happening effectively in the USA with the RFS and the low carbon fuel standard in California?
Well, I think there'd be a couple of opportunities for that to happen under our policy framework. As I mentioned, we've got the National Reconstruction Fund, which would support those facilities that are covered by the safeguard mechanism for their transition to net zero, but also other facilities. It's not limited to the safeguard mechanism, the 215 safeguard mechanism, large emitters. It's available for decarbonisation more broadly for industrial entities. It's also available for manufacturing of renewables and including biofuel and bioenergy producers. So I think there's an opportunity there. The Powering the Regions Fund is another example of where those opportunities emerge. But really, as I said, I don't really want to create the false expectation that I'll be sitting in my office in Canberra saying, oh, geez, that looks great or that looks great. There'll be a process for competing technologies to put their case for support under those schemes with an independent assessment process. So there'll be plenty, up to $3 billion from the National Reconstruction Fund. I mean, that's, we're talking serious money available for that process to go through. I think the other thing I just mentioned, because I know you're interested in SAF, is One of our other commitments was that the Commonwealth will be net zero itself by 2030. I mean, we are a big emitter as a government, in the top 30 if you include defence, and the top 50 if you don't include defence. So there'll be opportunities there for demonstration effects by the Commonwealth. That's a very serious commitment that we've made, and I think I'd welcome it if the current government committed to the actual Commonwealth being net zero by 2030. In relation to defence, defence isn't covered by the net zero commitment because we think it's just too prescriptive for defence given their very high emissions. But we do want to work with defence and see defence taking a leadership role in getting to net zero as soon as possible. They don't get a complete exemption while they're not covered by the net zero commitment. We are explicitly indicating we want to work with defence to get emissions down. And jet fuel emissions are a very big part of their emissions, and there are demonstration effects potentially if it all stacks up for our defence industries to be working with you and your members on SAF and other things, which can again provide some of that demand going forward. Provide the critical mass in Australia for things like SAF. If the Air Force and the Defence Forces more generally are working with you guys, I think there are great opportunities there to create a bigger SAF industry in Australia.
Right. Thanks, Chris. Another question, and this is a very political and difficult question, but the next one is, will your party be considering holistic carbon pricing in order to support the technology agnostic approach? It hasn't gone well for governments in Australia for many years, but would you consider it? It'd probably make things a whole lot simpler.
No. No, we've announced our policy. We've announced our policy last year. As I said, it's very comprehensive. It does take a holistic approach, as I've emphasised. But I think a couple of points in all seriousness. We've tried a carbon price in Australia. It was implemented. We're the only jurisdiction in the world that has ever implemented a carbon price and repealed it. That's what the toxic politics of the last 20 years have gotten us. That circle of actually crossing the Rubicon, putting a carbon price on, and then having a change of government to see the government repeal it. We're not going to start from scratch again. We're not going to go through that process again. There's a better way. And also, the world's come a long way since 2010. The cost of renewables has come down so much. I don't think we need an economy-wide carbon price to drive the take-up of renewables and other technologies. It's just not the case anymore. What you need is a good holistic policy approach, which is recognised in our policy, which is sectoral in one respect. It's got the safeguards mechanism for industry. It's got, electric vehicle incentives for transport, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it's not picking winners. It is basically providing that framework going forward, but it's not an economy-wide carbon price, and we won't be doing one.
Thank you. Next question we've got, it's a continuation on that theme to a degree, but will the ERF continue to be the key approach to emissions reduction, or would there be development of non-market approaches?
Well,
maybe the way of asking it is, will you keep the ERF?
No. Well, what we said, we will take the ERF and turn it into the Powering the Regions Fund. It will still be possible to progress carbon credits and ACCUs under the new Powering the Regions Fund, but we don't believe the way the government has been implementing the ERF has been best practice, and we believe there's better opportunities available for that money, and hence the Powering the Regions Fund will be the mechanism we use, but it will be still possible to progress carbon credits under that.
Okay. If anyone has any more questions for Chris, please send them through. I think we've gone through all of the questions on the Q&A.
I'm always delighted to exhaust the questions, James. It shows that
maybe you've already answered them all in your presentation, Minister. All right. Well, I think that's about it. And you are busy. And so, as I say, on behalf of Bioenergy Australia, thank you so much for taking the time, and look forward to continuing to work with the Labor Party, whatever the outcome of the election. But really, really appreciate your support for our sector. Thank you.
Well, particularly, James, if we happen to come first.
Yes, indeed.
There'll be lots to do.
Will. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, James. Good on you.